Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Scientific Archer. In today's episode, I want to talk about how arrow speed, specifically from changing the mass of an arrow, has an impact on your sight tape as well as your pin gaps. So once again, if we look at this study where I was shooting arrows that ranged from 350 grains in 50 grain increments all the way up until 650 grains, here's a reminder as to what their velocity at launch, reflected by V0, and then their velocity at 60 yards. If you want to see more information on how I got these numbers, please go watch the beginning episodes in this series where we talk about the introduction to the study as well as the downrange velocities of these different arrow masses. One of the things you'll notice about the velocities is that as you increase arrow mass, you decrease the launch velocity of that arrow. That is just because with a bow, you typically have fairly close to a constant kinetic energy that is produced by the arrow. Thus, by increasing the mass, you're going to decrease the velocity at launch to retain that same kinetic energy value. Out at further yardages, you'll see that the lighter arrows lose more velocity at 60 yards due to them having a larger acceleration due to drag because they have a lower mass. Once again, I'd like to refer to the first video in this heavy arrow versus light arrow series where we dive deeper into that. So please feel free to go back to that video if you have any questions on that. So moving on, I wanted to look at what were the sight tapes for each of those different arrow masses. So I used some ballistic software that I had wrote to generate the sight tapes for each of the arrow masses. And one of the things you'll notice is that in this case, I have all the 20-yard markers aligned. So you can see here that as you go down in yardages, you can see where the 30, 50, and 70-yard pins would actually align with those different arrow masses. One of the mistakes you might make is trying to use this directly to determine what is your furthest shooting distance that you can actually hold directly on. So what is the furthest pin you could actually dial to execute a shot? In practice, actually to do so, you would need to redetermine what is going to be the 20-yard positioning for each of the sight tapes to start where your pins would then fall from there. So I went to my local archery range and I did just that. I shot each of the arrows and measured their location relative to a starting position for the 350 grain arrow, and then adjusted each of the sight tapes to start where it would actually start in relation to my bow sight. And here you can see that for each of the arrow masses, as you increase from 350 grains, the 20-yard pin drops slightly as you increase arrow mass. From there, I then moved the bottom pin on my UV slider 2 all the way down to where it was just above the bubble. That gives me the maximum clearance in my bow sight. The thing that is limiting us in dialing to further yardages tends to be that your fletching will make contact with the bottom of your sight housing. The way that you can maximize your yardage is to then move that bottom pin as low as you can, minimizing the distance between that bottom pin and the bottom of your housing. And in this particular case, I found for the UV slider 2 that I can get the bottom pin roughly 9/16 of an inch from the bottom of the housing. The next thing I did was then applied that to each of the sight tapes, and I reflected that as a maximum clearance line that you can see here in orange. In practice, this means that anything above that line is going to provide us with enough clearance that we could actually dial our pins to that distance and take a shot holding directly on with that pin. And anything below that line is when we're going to experience fletching contact, which minimizes the distance we can shoot. Just because these lighter arrows offer us a further maximum shooting range does not mean they are a better choice for hunting situations. In most hunting situations, people should not be shooting much past 60, even 70 yards, and all of the arrow masses here for my particular bow setup allow me to shoot out to 70 yards. With the heavier arrows, yes, you will have less range forgiveness, but in the event of a follow-up shot for Western hunting situations, it is nice to be able to shoot for 70 yards. If you already have an arrow in an animal and it happens to stop at 70 yards, it's always better to try to take another shot to get more arrows into the animal, hopefully increasing the likelihood that that animal dies from those arrows. And once again, maximum shooting clearance is not the most important factor when it comes to hunting. We still want to make sure that we're shooting a sufficiently heavy arrow that we can penetrate the animal enough, ensuring that we get those double lung hits and pass-throughs like we desire that are going to be more lethal than a single lung hit and provide better bleeding if we get a full pass through and we do not have the arrow plugging the hole that it entered the animal. Using these sight tapes, I was then able to go show what the pin gaps would look like for all of the different arrow configurations. In this figure, we're just looking at the 350 grain, 450 grain, and 550 grain pin gaps. As you can see here, as we would expect, the faster arrows, being the lighter arrows, are going to produce tighter pin gaps than the heavier arrows. So you can see that the 350 grain arrow produces the tightest pin gaps, and then as we go up to the 550 grain arrow, the pin gaps just continue to increase from there. Another consideration for your pin gaps is the maximum pin distance between your top pin and bottom pin. And for the UV slider 2 in particular, you can move the top pin and bottom pin roughly 1 inch apart from each other, meaning that for a 5-pin configuration, the maximum pin gap between your 20 and 60 yard pins can only be a full 1 inch. And this is something I've noticed for other sites as well. I used to shoot a Trophy Ridge React 5, and one of the things for that is they had an advertised minimum arrow speed that you could shoot with the React technology, which basically set your pin gaps for you once you adjusted for 2 of the pins. It gave you a minimum speed where that technology would still work before you would run out of distance between those pins. So this is not just an exclusive UV slider 2 issue. Any housing is going to be limited by the distance you can separate your top and bottom pins. The UV slider 2 is probably one of the middle of the road sight housings, not being super small like your typical 31 millimeter scope housings, but not as large as some of your traditional fixed 5-pin sights. So looking at this, I took that maximum pin gap and overlaid that on top of the different sight tapes. And here you can see this is where it's overlaid on top of the 500 grain sight tape. And for this case, you can see that the 20-yard pin, we'd be able to bring that down to the 20-yard marker, and then the 60-yard pin aligns perfectly with the maximum distance that we could drop that in the sight housing, allowing us to adequately set pins for 20 to 60 yards with a 500 grain arrow. Moving on up, overlaid on the 550 grain arrow sight tape, you can see here that we once again will be able to move the 20-yard pin slightly down, but the furthest distance we could get is 58 yards. So we would not be able to sight in for 20 all the way out to 60 yards, which is a little bit limiting for a Western hunting situation where I would love to have a 5-pin sight, especially for when it comes to elk hunting, where when you're hunting brooding elk, things happen quickly. They're moving around constantly between yardages, and it's nice to have set pins out to 60 yards so I do not have to worry about redialing my sight during an elk encounter. Now, if I was using this for a whitetail hunting situation, I would have no problem running a 3-pin configuration and being able to set my pins for 20, 30, and 40 yards. Because as we saw with the animal drop forgiveness portion of this study, whitetail are extremely reactive and can move significantly at yardages between 30 and 40 yards, limiting how far we can effectively shoot whitetail at. So I have no problem with having just my fixed pins only going out to 40 yards for hunting whitetail. And for the 650 grain arrow case, overlaying the pins onto that, this is where after the 550 grain arrow, we were no longer able to set our pins for 20 to 60 yards. And honestly, once again, for a whitetail hunting situation, I have no problem with limiting my pins to only 40 yards in this case. And the 5-pin sight actually allows me to have reasonable distance between them such that the sight picture is not too crowded and I feel like I'm just putting a bunch of metal in between me and what I'm trying to hit. It has enough gap where I can do that, and it actually allows me to set my pin gaps at 5 yards so that I can be a little bit more effective pin gapping for those different yardages, knowing that I have a 20, 25, 30, 35, and 40 yard pin to help me in any whitetail situation that I might encounter. Okay, so I want to do a further comparison of a 450 grain versus the 650 grain pin gaps because I want to show how the pin gaps change as you go to those further yardages. Listed here are the different distances between each of the pin gaps. And as you can see, the 20 to 30 yard pin gap is the narrowest gap for each of the arrow masses. And then as you go out to the further yardages, the pin gaps slightly increase as you go out. For the 450 grain arrow, the pin gap between 20 and 30 yards and 50 and 60 yards reflects roughly a 28% increase in your pin gap. For the 650 grain arrow, because the arrow is retaining more of its downrange velocity because of its increased mass, the increase is only roughly 20%. Now, one of the things you'll still notice on this is that the pin gap for 50 to 60 yards for the 450 grain arrow is actually still smaller than the pin gap for the 650 grain arrow at 20 to 30 yards. What this shows you is that it's still easier to pin gap with the lighter arrow, even though the pin gaps increase slightly over time. A more narrow pin gap is always going to be easier to pin gap with. If you think about it in the most extreme case, if your pin gap reduces to 0, meaning that the pins are directly on top of each other from 20 to 60 yards, that would mean that for any distance you could hold directly on, more consistent with, the trajectory of a rifle bullet with how much faster they are going. It is much easier to hold directly on for any of those distances than if there was, several inches between each of your pins would be much more difficult to pin gap with. So I wanted to address one of the misconceptions that I hear on the internet about light arrows, and that is that I've heard people say that light arrows fall out of the sky at distance. And what they're really referring to is that the pin gaps, because they're losing more velocity, the pin gaps increase and get so wide that it is easier to pin gap with heavier arrows. Like we just described, where if pin gaps are more narrow, it is easier to pin gap with, not that if they are more consistently gapped throughout the entire pin configuration out to 60 yards. So for this, I wanted to compare the 450 grain and 650 grain sight tapes to each other to see how their pin gaps compared out to further distances. And zooming in on these two sight tapes, you can see here that the pin gap for the 450 grain arrow between 100 and 110 yards is similar in size to the 650 grain arrow between 20 and 30 yards. So I wanted to know the more exact numbers on this, so I dug into the software that I'd wrote and got the exact numbers for the pin gaps for each of these distances. And you can see here that the pin gap for the 450 grain arrows between 100 and 110 yards is 0.265 inches, where the pin gap for the 650 grain arrow between 20 and 30 yards was 0.266 inches. So those are pretty much equivalent to each other, meaning that the pin gaps are roughly the same between those two arrows at those two extremely different ranges. So if it were true that light arrows fall out of the sky at distance, you would expect the pin gap for the lighter arrow to be much larger at these further distances, but that is not what we're seeing. So I wanted to take it a little bit more to the extreme and compare the 350 grain versus the 650 grain arrow, because realistically 450 grains is not that extremely light in all reality for arrows. So doing the same exact thing, I took the 350 grain arrow and zoomed in on the portion of the sight tape between 120 and 130 yards, and I'm comparing that to the sight tape for the 650 grain arrow between 20 and 30 yards. And as you can see here, the pin gap between 120 and 130 for the 350 grain arrow is actually narrower than the 650 grain arrow pin gap is for 20 to 30 yards. So once again, diving into the software itself, I wanted to get exact numbers for people to be able to compare these two tapes to. And the pin gap for the 350 grain arrow between 120 and 130 yards was 0.223 inches, where the pin gap once again for the 650 grain arrow between 20 and 30 yards was 0.266 inches. So once again, if light arrows truly fell out of the sky, you would see a much different story here where the sight tape for the 350 grain arrow would have a larger pin gap at these further yardages than the 650 grain arrow. But you can see here, even comparing it to the best pin gap possible for the 650 grain arrow, which is at those short yardages of 20 to 30 yards, the 650 grain arrow still has a worse pin gap than the lightest arrow. And this is mainly because if you look back at the original numbers, at 60 yards, the 350 grain arrow is still going 257 feet per second, where the heaviest arrow was only going 210 feet per second at launch. So that is why you see that the lighter arrow still has a much better trajectory than the heavier arrow. And so while we talk about this from the comparison of light versus heavy arrows, from a perspective of what do their sight tapes and pin gaps look like, the real important thing to look at in hunting situations is more going to relate to how much potential to penetrate do you have, whether you're using kinetic energy or momentum as your measure to assess the arrow's potential to penetrate. Looking at the time of flight of an arrow, which is a reflection of how much an animal can react to the sound of your bow going off or the sound of the arrow in flight, and then the range forgiveness of your setup, where if you are 5 yards off in guessing the yardage to the target, how much higher or lower than your pin are you going to hit on the animal just because of that mistake in ranging. I definitely suggest looking back at some of the previous videos in this study where we discuss all of those things more in depth. The main reason I wanted to produce this video was to address those misconceptions that I have heard about light arrows and how they do not produce a better trajectory, how they fall out of the sky according to some people, things that are just not true, and we have the data to back up that argument. Once again, I want to thank everybody for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. I'll have the other videos in my series linked. I definitely highly suggest you look at those because, like I said, those are more important factors for determining what arrow mass you are going to choose for whatever hunting situation you find yourself in. Thanks for watching and have a great day.